Okay, windowsill, structural column. No, it's fine, just leave it like that. Windowsill, structural column over there. We're looking, this is looking face on, that's an elevation. Where does the seam in the substrate go? Where does the seam in the laminate go? The seam in your substrate needs to be here somewhere. What do we do when we make this cut in the substrate? Do we follow the windowsill or do we make it a square cut? I'm asking. I know how I do it. I want to know how you guys are doing it. You guys might not have done any of this yet, but...
Sorry, what is substrate? Which...
So if you're putting this board on the wall and then you're going to laminate this board,
okay,
and you've got to go around a windowsill. Okay. When you cut this board, do you follow the windowsill or do you cut it square?
Okay, okay.
Yeah. So then what do you do on the windowsill if the windowsill is not level? I know because I've run into this problem, right? So for me, what you need to do is you need to laser this thing out and figure out what it's doing ahead of time, right? You have to have some sort of idea of what's going on before you can come up with a plan to solve whatever problem you have. So normally, if you're looking at a windowsill from the side, they usually look like this, right? Yeah. If as it goes this way, the windowsill is not level, you can cut your substrate that you're going to lay on here and it can be proud. It can be higher and be perfectly level because you're going to put another board on top anyways, right? And then you can shim underneath of here as required to get this board to fit properly. Plus you've got a thickness here where you can screw down, right? So this is how I normally try and do it. Now, if it's really out or if you don't have a big window mullion here, right? There's sometimes reasons why you wouldn't do this. But if you can do this to make it perfectly level and square, that's what you want to do. You always want to have the seam and the substrate here. You never want to cut your laminate in this shape. If you cut your laminate in this shape, you're going to have a stress fracture here at some point in time. It's not an if, it's a when. It will fail if you put an inside corner like that. Every single time it's going to fail. If you do this, how are you going to fit your edge, your trim in there? You can't fit your trim in there if you do a radius.
I think I have it right. Let's say here, right? You have the trim here, right? This is the substrate. I will always go 1/8 and I don't go flush to my
right.
I go 1/8, and then I'm just gonna cut. Then when I cut it, I'm just gonna...
Right, so now you got to figure out how to make this cut with a router in the laminate and have a radius here, right? As opposed to making your cut in your backer with your fez tool, you can just draw on your board, nice square line, cut to it with the fez tool, no problem. Now you put your seam in your laminate right here, right? There's no weak point. You're not fucking around with a radius. You don't have to worry about coming out, right? I get there's more than one way to do it, but how am I going to explain to a new guy to put a radius here and to leave it out an 1/8? You know what I mean? Like this is what we're dealing with. So basically what I'm saying is you don't ever want to do an inside corner if you can avoid it, right? If we're dealing with one of those big HVAC things, right? You know how you got those huge vents sometimes, right? They always have a piece on the outside, a flange, right? It's usually 3/4 of an inch, maybe an inch, right? Like a frame that goes around the outside. Yeah. So when you cut the piece to go in here, you need to have like a 1/2 inch radius, not a little radius. You want the biggest radius you can possibly get, right? So when I did these, I would usually just lay the piece of laminate down on the cutting table. I would mark out, you know, where my hole was, and then I would just drill a hole here, drill a hole here, drill a hole here, drill a hole here. You got 4 holes, right? You don't even need a router. You can cut it with a jigsaw. You can cut it with the fez tool. You just set the fez tool to be ever so slight. You got to be careful that you don't go over the end, but as long as you know you've got a big flange that's going around to cover this over anyways, the cut doesn't have to be perfect. What's important is that it's covered by this and that it's got big radiuses on it so it won't fail, right? Because it will fail if it doesn't have a big radius. The other one that we run into is we run into this one where you got to do a little drop because you've got a fire pole, right? Fire poles with the little glass thing in them, they're the worst, right? So I don't know what you guys are trying to do. Like, are you trying to go tight to that thing?
No, I leave it like half inch go around.
Yep. Okay, that's good. Half inch or an inch, right? Because if you're not careful, because we've got a thickness of material, it'll actually impede the fire pole from operating properly. And I've gotten into trouble with that before.
Actually, at the Boston one, there was like the plastic that was before there.
Some of them have the.
They have that case around them. Yeah.
As soon as it was cold, we were trying to move it around, but too hard because there was still the. How do you call it? The plastic.
The alarm one?
Yeah, the plastic that was the glue on the top of the pool or something like that.
Yep.
So there was this was the wall protection. But trying to remove it, the alarm just goes nuts.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, you shouldn't be trying to remove anything. Like if you guys have stuff in your way, you have to talk to the general contractor and say, whichever trade is responsible for this, they have to move it for us, or you give us permission to just go around it. Well, regardless of, as long as it worked out, that's great, but you shouldn't be touching anything, right? Like you really have to be very careful about that. So we had a situation with Horst where they had the time card for their employees. They had the little machine where their employees logged in and logged out, and he actually asked for it to be removed because he needed to run the wall protection. And the electrician did it and then plugged it back in, and for 2 days they thought the thing was working. Wasn't working. It hadn't recorded anyone's hours logging in or logging out, and they tried to blame Horst, saying that he told the electrician to do it. Now Horst didn't send an email, which is Horst's fault, but what should have happened is, site picture, hey guys, we're working in this area, this whatever this is at 44 inches to the bottom, and I'm coming through with wall protection at 44. Are we moving this? Would you like me to cut around it? What would you like us to do here? Right? That's how that needs to go down. Well, again, you got to be careful even talking to the store manager. Like, all of that has to be coordinated through the general contractor, because if you go outside of the general contractor and talk directly to store staff and it doesn't work out, it's coming back on us, right? Like, they're going to blame us. The store is not going to take responsibility for it. So, you need to basically protect yourself is all I'm saying, right? So we do run into this kind of a situation as well with just light switches all the time, right? So if it's close, if it's like a half an inch or 3/4 of an inch, and you've lasered it all out and you know that you're going to be able to clear all of these if you lower it down, that's when you send an email. Hey, here's the laser line. Here's a picture of where the laser line is. If I go this much further down, I can clear all of these. Can we please have approval to lower the face or to lower the wall protection?
That's the best thing to do, especially if you're only a little bit off.
Yeah.
Just cut this little piece of aluminum.
Nightmare, right? And time consuming. But you can't just decide to do that. You can't go, oh, it'll be easier for me if I lower this down and then run it lower without asking for permission, okay? That's a big no-no. Anytime you're gonna diverge from what the drawings show, I don't care what the reason is, you have to ask permission, right? So again, this is part of the process. You can't show up on night one and just start throwing shit up and then beg forgiveness later. That's not how this works. They'll make us rip it all down if they want to be real dicks about it, right? And it can happen. So the best thing to do is go in there, take all your measurements, gather all the information, have all your site photos, and then probably you send it to me and Cameron, like through the shared email, right? You'll have a conversation with Cameron, say, hey, here's what I'm looking at. Look at this photo, look at this photo, look at this photo. I think if we lower everything down 3/4 of an inch, we can clear all of this and it'll be better for us, right? And then we'll go to the client and say, hey, client, is it okay if we do this? And then we'll get a yes or no answer. If the answer is no, the answer is no. And then we got to fuck around with all the little aluminum pieces, and that's just how it is. If the answer is yes, great. We'll drop everything down and we're motoring, right? But we don't ever make that decision, ever. I don't make that decision. Jim doesn't make that decision. Nobody makes that decision other than our client. So that's not something that even you can't have a conversation with Shane. Shane does not have the authority to make that decision. He can tell you to do it, but then when the owner walks through and the owner's interior designer, an architect walk through and look at it and go, well, how come these are all so low? We didn't do it in the drawings this way. Like, what's going on, guys? Whether Shane gave you approval or not doesn't matter. They'll say, no, we don't want it that way. You guys got to raise it all. So be very, very careful about making these choices on site. Like, it's not ever a choice for us. We make a proposal, we ask for permission, we get a yes or no, we proceed. That's how this has to go. So this is, again, why we stress so much about planning, right? Because you can't plan this if you haven't looked at it all ahead of time, right? So for me, I think night one moving forward needs to be just go through and take measurements and figure things out, right? It's hard when you haven't done a lot of this because you don't actually know what you're looking for. You don't know what the problems are, right? But you can throw up a laser and figure out what the top height of the fascias or of the wall protection is going to be, and you can see if the laser runs into something, that's going to be a problem. You can laser out windowsills. Generally, windowsills are not too bad. Usually the window guys, they got to put their windows in level, right? So the windowsills are usually all right, but not always. If we're going to do this arrangement here, that's going to be your two seams in your laminate. What do you think we need to know before we get going on cutting the pieces? For sure, but we already are going to do that anyways. What's this number? If this number is 8 foot 3 inches, what do you think we should be doing here? Are we going to put an 8 foot piece in and then go like this and put a little 3-inch piece right here to make up the distance? Yeah. So, it'll depend on how much material you have. It'll depend on whether there's a grain direction on the laminate. Like, there's a bunch of different factors. My preference is you put one smack dab in the center, right? That's my preference. The reality is no client's probably ever going to know that you did that, right? So, if you needed to run a 5 foot piece and then you got a 3 foot piece left over from the last window that you did, or a 3 foot 6, I'm okay with that, right? Most of the time, I think we can get these in one. It's rare that there's windows that are more than 8 feet. And if they're more than 8 feet, they're usually a lot more than 8 feet, right? They're like 12 or 14 or whatever it is, right? They're a big bay of windows. But again, these are some things that you need to look at, right? And then obviously, always the substrate seams are never in alignment with the seam of the laminate. They always have to overlap, right? So you never put your substrate seam here and put your laminate seam also here. That never happens. You got to offset it minimum 6 inches, right? Bare minimum. Preferably more like 1.5 feet, 2 feet. So that's not always easy to plan out, and it doesn't always work out, but that's what you got to try and achieve. And you definitely have to make sure that they never stack one on top of the other, because it's going to fail if they stack one on top of the other. Well, the substrate, you don't have to use a full sheet, right? Because you can have more seams in the substrate. Nobody's ever going to know because you're just going to be laminating over top of it. What you got to be careful about with the substrate is if you're going to cut the substrate shorter, right? Like, let's just say you're talking about if you've got an inside corner here, you want to start out with maybe a 4 and a 4 or whatever it is, right? It has to land on a stud. There's got to be a stud there, right? So you have to know that there's a stud there, and you got to go halfway across the stud so that you can screw 2 boards to the stud. So if you don't have a stud there, that's going to dictate where you can go and where you can't go with your substrate. But I agree, obviously, what best case scenario is that you can get a full piece from the corner to the edge here. That's what you want, assuming that this is less than 8 feet, right? Again, you got to look at this number. If this is 8'4", it's like, goddamn, fuck, you're screwed, right? So then you got to try and put a seam in here. And you do run into issues where you start getting too many seams because just because of how the layout goes. You guys just have to look at that and you have to manage it, right? It's all there is to it. So it again comes back to pre-planning. Yep.
So if we have like 2 feet here and the window is only say 1 foot wide, so can we use one piece here and avoid that? And
Nope.
So it has to be always.
It will 100% fail if you try and do an inside corner with the laminate. There is no question about it. You are going to get a stress crack there.
So some spaces it's just like a 3-inch and 4-inch behind the windows. So
How do you mean?
like an end corner or something.
Where the window
Some
ends
places,
into the corner.
Yeah,
so just a 4-inch.
it's going to fail there. It will fail there.
There
So,
was a couple jobs we went to.
Same deal.
yeah,
Then
yep,
Before they did demo, I showed guys pressure points.
yep,
They cracked it.
yep. You go and
Store
look.
had quite a few.
You go and look at any store where they've done that. Trust me, some of them are stores I've done, right? Where I didn't know any better and I thought I could get away with doing a radius, and it just, there's too much variance in temperature and humidity in Alberta, right? Like, especially at the front of the stores. Vestibules are the absolute worst.
For example,
We don't know.
what is
We don't know.
the one I just,
It's the hard thing. The big from
St. Albert. That's the old land of
So it's a 4-inch space. There is a, we can say like a
Column, structure.
column and
Yep.
structure, anything else. Same things here. 4-inch and 48 and 10-inch.
Yep,
So will you 4-inch straight here, see?
yep,
Is that okay? Is no issue?
yep, yep. Same with the 10-inch. You got to do the seam here too,
Same here too.
right? Because otherwise you're going to get stress fractures.
It's a final, it's a no big.
So the architect is going to complain. The architect's going to say laminate's available in 8-foot lengths. There should not be any seams if it's under 8 feet. And then that's for me to deal with, right? And I'll say, yes, if there was no cutouts, you'd be absolutely correct. But if we do this the way you're asking, there's going to be a stress failure and I can't warranty the material. That's all there is to it. And that'll be the end of it, right? Because I have to put a 2-year warranty on the laminate for Superstore or for any Loblaws projects now. It's not a 1-year warranty anymore. So it will crack within 2 years and we will be coming back.
And I see has a point. Like I was,
Pardon me? We've got color match silicone, right?
so
So,
Hansley like 37 years ago, I started doing countertop. See, this is your countertop corner at the top.
Yep.
We always left it round because we didn't have any corners.
Yep.
Angle going on, because yeah, you know how you get any movement.
Yep.
Or it shrinks no matter what. Laminate's a paper product. It expands and contracts.
Yep.
Especially in Alberta.
yep. There is no plastic in plastic
What
laminate.
I've experienced when I
So you guys will notice when you put the laminate up, and it depends on which laminate, but the laminate in the Safeways, the Formica stuff is thin now, like really thin.
laminates went a couple layers thinner.
Yeah, and it shrinks significantly. So like you'll put it in, install it, but it tight, like tight. Come back 3 weeks later, there'll be like an 1/8 of an inch gap there, right? So that's why we have the color match silicones. So we have color match silicones for pretty much every laminate that we use. The color match silicones are meant to treat the seams after they've shrunk. So obviously you can't do it the day that you install it, right? So you got to put the laminate in, you got to wait 2, 3, 4 weeks, depending on how long the project is. Like for me, it's one of the things you want to do at the very end, right? That's what you had to do at the Walmart. I had to go through because they were complaining. I know all those seams were tight when we put them in. Like they might not have been like so tight, but they weren't, you know, 1/8 plus, which is what we were dealing with after everything had shrunk down. That's the other reason why you're going to have a stress fracture there, is because the laminate shrinks at a different rate than the substrate that we're using. And that's why you get the pressure, the crack, the failure there, right? Yeah, yeah. So, you know, if we were someplace where the range of temperature and the range in humidity wasn't as great, but I mean, it'll be plus 35 in the summer, it'll be minus 40 in the wintertime, right? And the humidity goes up and down with it. Plus you're in a grocery store, so they've got a lot of heat generated by. But then they'll leave the doors open on the refrigeration, so now you got a bunch of cold air. Any humidity causes condensation, right? That's why we get the waving in our MDF bases, and why we stopped using MDF for paint for our faces on our step-ups saying no froze, right? Because there's so much condensation that the MDF would take on water and it would expand, and you'd have a long straight piece like this, and all of a sudden it's a banana.
Well, these
Like,
guys
it's
have
just popping
experienced
out.
that twice now.
Yeah. Yeah.
Decks, faces, and faces.
Yep. And I mean, I get clients calling me and complaining about that. I'm like, my guys couldn't install it that way if they tried. Like, there is no chance.
We actually had that up.
It will if there's an increase in humidity. Yeah, but it's Basically, all the materials that we're using are coming from someplace that's much more humid than Alberta. So generally it shrinks, and then it may gain a little bit of moisture, but it's never going to gain as much moisture as it had. And it doesn't seem to matter how long we acclimatize it for. Like it just, you know, it can sit in the rack for 3 weeks. We still get shrinkage when we put it in the job site, right? So it's a problem. It's a constant issue that we're dealing with, is shrinkage in all of our material, and sometimes expansion depending on the situation.
So is it okay to do a square of laminate around the air supply window?
Yep. You don't
There
have a
won't be
choice.
no choice.
It will, but you can put a big radius here, right?
Okay.
The problem is you can't put a large enough radius here because you have to come around with aluminum trim. And now the radius pushes your aluminum trim up.
The best
right?
part of this is usually that grill's still gonna be there. So when you cut your material and you trace it out, you can leave it this much bigger all the way around. And then what I do is fit it. I take it down, I take my laminate, and then I route it out when I clamp it down. I guarantee that that thing goes in there.
Yep.
Yeah, that's
And you need to leave the biggest radius possible, right? So when you drill your 4 corners, a 1/2 inch radius, 3/8, whatever, a big radius, right? Not just a little teeny tiny radius. And if you just cut it square like this with a jigsaw or the fez tool or whatever, it's gonna crack here, it's gonna crack here, it's gonna crack here, it's gonna crack here.
Because of me repairing some of the loose laminate that come off because when you're spraying and these are active, the contact's really light, right? So it blows all over and you don't get enough in there. The last one I did, I cut this, fit it, cut my laminate, fit it, and there was another angle coming off a little bit. So when I went to put my laser was on, so I actually sprayed the sheet, stuck it to the wall, sprayed my laminate, stuck it to the wall right away. Of course it was shorter. You know, my MDF or whatever was here was shorter, and I avoided that.
Yeah.
Because in the wintertime, they don't shut that shit off.
No, exactly. That's actually probably the worst case scenario for the laminate to survive. The other thing is when you're gluing around one of those things, you need to make sure you use probably a little bit more glue than normal, not a ridiculous amount more, right? Enough glue is enough. A tiny bit more is okay. Way too much more, it doesn't work, right? So, yeah.
Sometimes you get that problem in a vestibule if they leave the doors
Yeah.
open where you can go in and out. Somebody comes in, lock the door, and then spray.
Yeah.
Because that's a pain. That's because you'll get covered.
And you really got to make sure you give the spray contact enough time to dry, right? Because you can get away with putting it on when it's just a little bit sticky on a big sheet. It's usually okay, but it really needs to be dry to the touch. You should not be able to have any glue come off when you put the back of your hand to it. If it sticks to your hand at all, it's still too wet.
That's why I should.
And then it's got to be rolled. Like it absolutely has got to be rolled. Every square inch of every piece of laminate that goes up has got to be rolled. Right? It's called contact cement for a reason, right? It's that pressure when you put the two pieces together that allows the glue to bond to itself. If you don't put adequate pressure, it isn't bonding, right? So has to be rolled. That's all there is to it. So I know that's a sucky job and it's not fun, but it has to be done. And if it's rolled properly, that also will help alleviate some of the shrinkage issues, right? Because if it's glued down properly, it means it can't move. So it will put tension in panels for sure, but you know, it is what it is. Okay, is there anything else we got to cover? What do we do around electrical outlets? Are we trying to get the electricians to remove the outlets, or are we?
To be honest with you, that's the safest, is to at least attempt that
Yeah.
for anybody.
So far, to get the electrician to remove
The whole plug, and then cap everything off to make it safe.
So that is the safest way,
Yeah.
actually, in commercial especially.
That is what should be happening. So we don't ever pull that stuff ourselves. We should never be touching electrical. We don't ever touch a fire pole, ever. How much routing should we be doing on these panels after install?
Yeah, but like I say, this might be a situation when we're talking about what space is between here and there. These might be out,
Yeah.
and your seam might not line up on the next one. So you might have just a little bit You don't, start going like this. But there again, you want to try and square it out a bit.
If you're gonna hide some funk, where do you think you should hide it? Top or bottom? Because you gotta remember, down here, you got 4 or 6 inch rubber base,
If it's not a curb, you have
and
to-
then you got a 2x2 bumper on top of that, if it's not a curve. Exactly. So if you've got that to work with, you've got 8 or 10 inches at the bottom here where you can, if it's tight here and it's a mill down here, by the time you get 10 inches up, you probably can't even tell, right? So, it's good to understand where, if you're having a problem, because we run into problems, where you can cheat and how you can hide it, right? So, obviously, here, you want a tight seam. Here, in the corners that are exposed, like, we've had stores where the guys somehow the laminate's done that, and the trim has come through here, and you got, that's an exaggeration, but you got, let's say, 1/8 of an inch that's exposed. If that's in the middle of a run somewhere, we can probably hide it. We can probably get our color match silicone and put it in there, and nobody's ever going to notice. If that same thing happens right here at this corner, there's no chance. We got to redo it, right? So obviously, you don't ever want this to happen. Like, there's no reason that should ever happen. Yeah. Sometimes the paper on top doesn't even make it to the end, right? And you get like an ugly little brown section left over on some of this commodity grade laminate. Like, it's just absolute fucking garbage, right? You guys have the Fez tool, you've got the square for the Fez tool. It's relatively easy to stack up 4 or 5 sheets and clean the ends, right? But even on exterior walls with the self-drilling screws, sometimes they're so friggin' heavy, it's just easier to pre-drill. How are we pre-drilling? Like, for me, all those pre-drillers, they look like this, right? I like the ones with the tapered bits that get smaller and smaller as they go. I like these ones, but they're very, very delicate, right? So really, all you need to do is adjust the bit so that only this much sticks out. You don't even need to go all the way through the wood, really. You need to get most of the way through it. Depending on the screws you're using, if you've got screws that have the shank at the top that don't have threads on them, then it'll just suck them right up. I feel like the drywall screws probably have thread all the way up though, right? Because it'll just strip out in the drywall like that, right? So then if we're gonna do drywall screws, when you drill your hole, your pre-drilled hole, so if this is your wood, and this is gonna be your pre-drilled countersink, you need to drill all the way through, and it needs to be a bigger diameter than the screw you're using. Yeah, otherwise it won't suck it up. It'll just get jammed in the wood, and you'll end up with a gap between the wall and your board, right? Whereas if your hole is bigger, it's gonna go through, it'll drill in here, and then it'll just pull it in until it's there, and then you're good. Because I know the wood screws work not bad in the light gauge ones as long as you don't over torque them. It's just that it's so easy to over torque them, right? So the drywall screws have a finer thread. They probably do grab on quite a bit better in that light gauge stuff. But then you have to pre-drill properly. But if you pre-drill properly and you sink all your heads correctly, then you don't have to fuck around sanding or dicking around with any of that stuff, right?
Because of mushrooming out.
Exactly. Because if you just try and drive it through, you get the bulge right here and the bulge right here all the way around, and then you got to go and sand all that off. Okay, so do we have any questions here about what we're doing, how we're doing it, why we're doing it? We all clear on the plan? There is a use for a brad nailer when doing wall protection, right? Like if you've got a wall and you've got your laser set up, there is no reason that you can't go through with the brad nailer and just pop this panel up so that panel's hanging in the right place, right? And then move on to the next panel. And if you're working as a 3-man crew, there should be somebody coming behind right away to screw that panel off to the wall so it doesn't move, right? Let's just say we've got this whole situation, but now we've got a concrete curb with an angle on it, like this, running across this entire length. How do we set this up?
Because sometimes the guys doing the concrete on that aren't really neat.
At all.
And then especially when you see like a little bump in there, that's where you break your laminate. So you got to stick your laminate on And that might take two people, depending if it's bigger sheets. And you gotta scribe it because you have those big gaps at the bottom, right? So we'll go like this and like this.
So, so we were able to scribe at Chester here, but cutting was an issue, so I will wait for the next step.
Yeah.
Scribe we could do right way.
So
I wanted to use jigsaw, but we ended up using first one, but that's the right point. We needed to discuss more.
yeah.
Because it's very, not just the slope and it becomes some of it.
Yeah. So how did you guys mark it?
Pencil. Usually carpenter pencil, so that would be 3/8 or so,
Yeah.
right off the top.
And is that enough?
Sometimes a Sharpie looks good if you got a sharp one.
It was enough, then I would use a piece of washer and then hold it in the middle and run across, and that was perfect, just like the pencil.
So are you guys just setting the board on the curb and then scribing like that?
Board with a little more leeway, we can give ourselves plenty to quarter.
I know, but I'm asking, like, how are you locating your substrate, your board that you're trying to scribe? Are you just setting it on the curb and then scribing, or what is your process?
Board, we just take out an average. We do a single cut. We got 2 cuts.
So then you end up with a gap, potentially.
Yeah, but we close it up with the laminate.
Yeah.
Very carefully.
Yeah. So then that laminate ends up being pretty weak, right? Because it's unsupported, right?
Yeah.
Yeah. So you have to be careful doing that. It will work. It can work. But what if you were going to do it properly? You're going to try and scribe your board tight. What would the process be?
You have to have it all before you scribe it.
Okay.
I think we must go on the board with an angle on the bottom.
Yep.
On the bottom of the
About, yeah.
level. Then if there is like a bump, it is easy to remove the 16 or 1/8 and the 4.
Yeah. So for me, the way I used to do it is you've got your level line with your laser, right? You've got a brad nailer. Put your board an inch up, pin it to the wall, right? If it's a little bit tall, so let's say you made it a 1/2 inch tall or 3/4 of an inch tall, you put it an inch up, right? Then you set your scribe at 1 inch, right? And you just run it along the bottom and it's gonna do this. Then when you cut that scribe line, because your scribe's been set at 1 inch and you're 1 inch high here, it's just gonna drop down and it's gonna sit at the right spot, right? If you just set it on the concrete curb and then scribe it that way, it's gonna be like this, it's gonna be like that, it's gonna be all over the place. So this is more work for sure, but if you do it this way, you can use that board as a template for the laminate that needs to fit there, right? So you do have to be mindful that you're gonna overlap your seams and all of that jazz, but you can take that board and you can take the next board, and if you're working with something that's like a really shitty curve, if you absolutely have to, you can do your substrate in 4-foot sections, so that you're only dealing with 2 4-foot sections at any one point in time, right? And then you can use those as a template to router your laminate. And then basically you would tape your laminate to your substrate, right? Tape it 1/8 of an inch down at the top, and then just run your router along the bottom, and now you got a perfect piece, right?
Pull back.
Pardon me?
Full back.
With full backing. Now, if you've got a slope curve, you do it Ansley said, right? You cut it on an angle, but the same process works. And it doesn't have to be a perfect cut on the bottom, right? Like you can use the Fez tool and you can kind of, you know, you can line it up and get part way and then move it and get part way and move it and get part way. You can do it like that. It doesn't have to be absolutely perfect, right? You can be within a 16th of an inch, you'll be okay. Even if you for me. Yeah, if you have to. Exactly. So, you know, if you've got a reasonably okay curve, that's one process for doing it. The other process is like what Ansley was talking about, is you can cut the bevel first, and now you've removed a significant amount of material, you scribe, then you can either use a belt sander or you use the little planer or whatever you want, and you just kind of hog out that little bit that you need to hog out. It makes it a lot easier to scribe it if you're dealing with like basically most of it's straight and then you got a little hump in the middle. That's a good way to do it, right? Or you can use a jigsaw or whatever. Like, there's all sorts of different solutions.
It's more easy to strap with like a 4-inch material or 1 year and the whole 3/4.
Yep.
And now to try to make it square.
Yeah, I would do it like this and cut straight if I was on a flat curve and I was able to make my cuts with the fizz tool. If I actually had a hump like this over a short distance, that doesn't work so well anymore. But you sort of have to look at what you're dealing with and then decide what the best solution is, right? For me, the important part is that it's got to be level, right? And then if you're able to do it in a way where the part that you cut can be the template for your laminate, that saves you now having to scribe the laminate. Because if you just throw the board up and now you're coming across to put the laminate on, now you got to scribe the laminate too, right? So you want to try as much as possible to only do the work once, right? Instead of having to do it 2, 3, or 4 times. So that's just how I used to do it. Right? I ran into all the same problems that you guys run into. I ran into all the same shitty walls and all the same shitty curves and all the same shitty floors. Like, nothing's changed in 20 years, I can promise you. In fact, it's probably gotten worse, not better. Be my guess, right? Like, some of the walls you see now, just like, holy Christ, fucking horrific. Do you guys know what the acceptable standard is for a framer now when it comes to plumb? If you're out a 1/4 inch or 10 feet, that's considered okay for commercial.
That's big.
Yeah, that's brutal. 1/4 inch. So if you're out of plumb 1/4 inch from top to bottom on 10 feet, that's within the acceptable standards. Yeah, exactly. It's a joke. Yeah, it's an absolute.
It's funny.
I actually had to rip on it because my plane walls had to go up against the wall connection, right?
Yeah.
I actually had to, my cane cleats, screw it, and hold it up so bad. I had
Not
to
even
rip
straight.
the strips on it, and we run the same way.
Yeah. Yeah. So on an 8-foot length, you definitely need one at the top, you need one at the bottom. I would prefer 2 in the middle. That's my preference. You can get away with 1. You know, when you're working around a windowsill, there should always be frame around the windowsill, so there's no mystery as to where that is. At the bottom, there's always bottom track. The problem is sometimes we'll get high enough up that we miss the bottom track, right? Because this is only 1.5 inches, right?
Concrete bumper.
Right?
With the concrete.
If there's a concrete bumper, you're never going to get the bottom track. Yeah.
Plus, it can be rusted out.
Yep, it can. So, I mean, you got to go through and you got to find all the studs. I mean, for me, stud finders work great, but if you're putting a board over this whole thing and you think there's a stud in this area, just get a small drill bit and drill some holes until you hit something. And then you know there's something there.
Electrical.
Then you test, you go 16 and 16, make
Electrical.
sure you hit something.
Pipe is bent.
Yeah, it depends on where you are on the wall and what other walls tie into it. And also because it's a reno, the first guy might have built it on 16-inch centers, and now they've gone and reno that wall already, and the next guy built it on 16-inch centers, but he started at 13 inches and then went 16.
Yeah.
And then some other guy came along and did whatever the hell he did, right? So, like, do you guys have stud finders? Are you rolling with stud finders? Yeah. Okay. Okay. So we
Yeah.
need to definitely have stud finders.
Sometimes we are running into so low quality material like just a thin.
Yes.
So I was doing
Expensive.
drill hole and screwing in 24 inches across, not a feeling of any stud at all.
This one.
Light torque, strong torque, and I drill a hole, buy a camera, see
Cheaper?
where the stud is. Okay, stud is
Which one?
there, but it's too weak. Once I was tightening, I wouldn't
What's
feel
cheaper?
anything even slightly.
Yeah.
So that's why I really appreciate the idea of having those really quick self-tapping screws.
Yeah.
But the behavior is different. If you use wooden screws, it will actually rip the metal off, it will make it wider. So
Yeah.
I think it has less to do with the threads, but more to do with the starting
Using
of the
self-tap.
hole
Yeah.
in the metal.
Right.
Yeah.
So self-tapping, it creates a fine hole, and the thread after that will really sit in tight.
Yeah.
But if you use the wooden screws,
There's a magnet
uh,
where you put
you are doing
there's a
really
stud.
good at all.
The other problem you run into is if you're looking at it from the top, the steel studs are shaped like this, right? And they have a little edge on them, kind of like that. And a lot of times these things will get damaged before the drywall goes up. If you're coming through with a screw and you hit right here, it'll often just bend this thing, right? It won't actually penetrate. So you need to be at least in the middle and preferably towards the back edge where it's a little bit stiffer. Problem is, you don't know where you're hitting the stud, right? So you would get these sometimes where you could feel it push away and then you'd hear it like click, 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 because this thing would be, you know, your screw would be here and this would be stuck in the threads and it would just be kind of bouncing around. So if that happens, like you basically got to try and figure out where the outside edges are, either doing it with a pilot bit or however you're going to do it. If your stud finder is accurate enough and it tells you where the outside corner is, then you got to try and get sort of relatively close to the other corner if you had no luck there. Sometimes you just got to put another hole in. That's just how it goes. Like I've been in stores where the steel studs were not even fastened at the top or the bottom. They're literally just floating in there. The drywall was the only thing that was holding them in place, right? Like I've seen all sorts of shit over the years. Oops, sorry. So, you know, you're gonna run into troubles. Sometimes you run into an exterior wall that's cinder block, concrete, or whatever, right? So then it becomes a totally different process for attaching, right?
Yeah, we done that in PTX and exterior walls and superstore.
Yep. So then at that point, we got to go to tap composite and hammer drill, right? So you still have to pre-drill to countersink, because if you don't, the tap con's just going to strip out before it sinks all the way in, right? You need to drill a bigger hole because generally the tap cons are larger, so you need a larger pilot hole so that the tap con doesn't get stuck in your wood and it can actually pull the wood tight to the wall. That would be a situation where we maybe try and use some silicone to back up the tap cons, right? The silicone's not there to hold the board to the wall, but it's there to just act as an additional security.